in the blistering heat of an unforgiving Roman summer, as the sun beat down relentlessly on the blood-streaked cobblestones of the Forum where merchants bickered over amphorae of olive oil and garum with the same ferocity that gladiators would later display in the Colosseum, a place where the air stank of sweat, rotting fruit, and the iron tang of blood. You, a soft-handed modern human used to climate control, 3 meals a day, and Google Maps, would already be lost and overwhelmed, your nostrils burning from the stench of open sewers running like diseased veins along the narrow, dangerous streets choked with shouting vendors, stray dogs, runaway slaves, pickpockets, and mule-drawn carts, the drivers of which cursed in Latin with an elegance and venom you could never comprehend, pushing you ever closer to the walls as your linen tunic, roughly borrowed from a local in exchange for your strangely shiny sneakers, clung to your sweat-drenched skin and itched with every step, the scratchiness of the poorly woven fabric reminding you that you're thousands of years from your antibacterial, moisture-wicking t-shirts, and you haven't even made it to breakfast yet, which would consist not of eggs, bacon, and coffee but stale bread dipped in watered-down wine if you were lucky. Though by now your stomach is already churning not just from hunger but from the horror of witnessing a public punishment outside the Basilica Julia, where a thief had his hand crushed on an anvil by a magistrate's order, and the crowd, including children, laughed and cheered like it was theater, the same way they later would at an execution in the Circus Maximus, which you mistakenly entered thinking it was a horse show, only to realize in a dizzy moment of revulsion that the horses were actually men dressed as barbarian invaders being hunted by real soldiers for sport, the blood soaking the sand in your shoes, which you've since abandoned because they marked you as a foreigner, and now you're barefoot, sunburnt, confused, dehydrated, and terrified, because your Latin is poor, your accent worse, and the locals, suspicious of your strange speech and manner, have started eyeing you like a criminal or a madman or worse, a slave on the run, which might be your fate if you're not careful, because in ancient Rome there is no human rights commission, no embassy, no Uber. And the best you can do is find shelter in a shady tavern where the wine is sour, the stew questionable, and the patrons gruff, their eyes narrowed as they ask where you're from, and you can't say, the future, because they'll think you're possessed, and not in a funny way, but in the kind of way that gets you exorcised or stabbed or both. So you lie and say Hispania or Britannia or wherever your tired mind can conjure, though the lie stumbles out with such hesitation that it only arouses more suspicion, and someone jokes you must be a spy, which is met with laughter, but not the good kind, more like the kind before a brawl. So you slip out the back door and run, heart pounding, feet bleeding from the rough stone. And you think you see a way out, maybe a gate, but it's a trap, and now you're surrounded by guards in armor that clinks and gleams, their spears pointed at your chest, and you realize with dawning horror that you don't know the customs, the laws, or the language well enough to defend yourself, and when they ask you questions you can't answer, they drag you away to a holding cell beneath the praetor's hall, where you sit in the dark, surrounded by rats and the groans of other prisoners, wondering how you ever thought you could survive a day in ancient Rome, because it's only midday, and already your mind and body are breaking. As the heavy wooden door to the dim, urine-stenched cell creaked open with a sound like the groaning hinges of Hades itself, and you were yanked roughly to your blistered feet by a guard whose breath reeked of garlic and spoiled wine. You barely had the strength to protest as he barked orders in a rapid-fire Latin dialect that made your head spin, dragging you up a flight of slimy stone steps past other prisoners, most of whom looked more beast than man after days or weeks in the darkness. And just when you thought the light of the outside world would be a relief, it hit you with the force of a hammer, making your eyes water, your knees buckle, and your already sunburned skin feel like it was catching fire again, though the real fire began in your stomach when you saw the rostra, the speaking platform in the forum, where criminals were paraded, ridiculed, and sometimes executed in full public view. And while you didn't understand the entirety of the soldier's rant, the crowd that had begun to gather made it clear that you were being set up as some kind of foreign man and maybe even a spy. Your strange clothes, odd behavior, and incoherent mumbling used as evidence against you, with one man even claiming he saw you talking to a statue of Jupiter like a lunatic, and your pleas in broken Latin did nothing but amuse the gathering crowd, whose laughter grew louder as a toothless vendor began selling roasted chestnuts nearby like it was a comedy show, not a potential death sentence. And when you tripped over your own tunic and fell to your knees, a child, no older than 8, threw a rotten fig at your face, hitting you square in the cheek as others joined in, and for a brief moment you wished the ground would open and swallow you, not realizing that beneath your feet were the cloacae, the sewers of Rome, vast and winding and full of disease, filth, and fugitives. A fitting metaphor for how you felt as 2 guards pulled you upright and hauled you toward the magistrate's tribunal, where a robed official, bored and sipping watered-down wine, waved lazily for the accusations to begin, which consisted of wild guesses, superstitions, and pure xenophobia, none of which you could refute. And though you tried to gesture, to explain, to plead, your voice cracked, your throat raw from thirst and fear, and all you could manage was a half-choked "Non sum hostis, I am not an enemy." But that phrase only drew sneers, because even if you weren't an enemy, you certainly weren't Roman, and that was bad enough, for in this world citizenship was more than legal status. It was protection, identity, even life itself, and without it you were just a body waiting to be used, discarded, or forgotten. So when the magistrate finally spoke, it was to order your transfer to the slave pens, not because he believed you were a slave, but because it was the easiest way to make you disappear. And as the iron collar was fastened around your neck and you were marched through the streets past the temples, bathhouses, and insulae, the towering apartment blocks of the Roman poor, you realized that even the filthiest tenant in the highest, most dangerous floor of those fire-prone buildings had more status than you, a stranger, a nobody, a future dweller out of time and luck. And when they locked you in the slave yard behind a tavern that doubled as a brothel, and left you among a dozen others, some weeping, some silent, some singing in languages you couldn't place, you felt your knees give out, and for the first time you cried, not the dramatic kind but the broken, dry kind, the kind that comes from deep inside when the body is too dehydrated to produce proper tears. And just as night fell, a cruel wind began to blow, swirling dust through the iron bars as a rat scurried across your foot and a drunken Roman soldier passed by, laughing with his comrades about how easily the empire swallowed foreigners like olives, pit and all, and you curled into yourself, thinking of your bed, your phone, your life, none of which existed anymore. Not here, not now. And as the stars rose over the 7 hills and the city quieted to a low hum of late-night gossip, illicit liaisons, and distant dogs barking at the moon, you whispered a prayer, not to Jupiter or Mars or Apollo, but to whoever might be listening across time, begging to go home. Knowing in your heart that in ancient Rome, a single day was not a test of endurance, but a sentence passed by history itself on the unprepared. As the cold cobblestones beneath your emaciated, callous body sucked away the last remnants of warmth from your trembling limbs during the breathless hours of the Roman night, where every distant scream or shattering amphora became a fresh reminder that this city of marble and blood never truly slept. You tried to close your eyes and find some fragment of the modern world in your mind. Maybe the hum of your refrigerator, the glow of your smartphone, the soft linen of your bed. But instead all you could summon was the overwhelming ache in your bones and the sound of slaves whispering in dialects you couldn't place, plotting escape or simply dreaming of better masters. And as the iron gate creaked open at dawn and a heavy-set lanista, a trainer of gladiators entered with 2 armed men, scrutinizing the rows of chained humans like meat at market. Your heart pounded with new terror because while you didn't understand every word of his negotiations with the slave yard's overseer, you understood enough. Strong legs, foreign, desperate, cheap. And soon you were yanked from your place, your collar inspected like a dog's. And without consent, without question, you were bought, branded, and marched, yes, marched, barefoot and starving, out of the city and down the Appian, way with a dozen other unfortunate souls, bound for a ludus, a gladiator school, on the outskirts of the city where life expectancy was measured not in years, but in fights survived. And by the time the gates of the training compound clanged shut behind you and the sour scent of sweat, blood, and despair filled your nostrils, you realized there would be no speeches, no inspirational music, no slow-motion training montages. Only brutal drills with wooden swords, endless hours of shield work, and beatings for mistakes. Because this was not a place for growth, it was a factory of violence, and the dominus, the master of the school, a man whose eyes were colder than the steel he carried, made it very clear with a few choice words and a swift blow to a slave who didn't bow fast enough, that disobedience meant death. And as he tried to mimic the stances, the movements, the shouts of your fellow recruits, Gauls, Numidians, Greeks, Syrians, each tougher and more desperate than the last, your muscles screamed, your lungs burned, and your modern sense of fairness shattered. For here the strong thrived and the weak perished. And when night came, and you lay curled on a lice-ridden mat, your entire body pulsing with pain, you thought about your old gym, your yoga classes, your protein shakes, and how utterly useless they were here, how absurd it seemed now to complain about delayed Wi-Fi or lukewarm coffee, because in Rome, survival wasn't about comfort, it was about endurance. And as the days passed, each one a blur of training, punishment, and humiliation, you began to lose parts of yourself, your sense of identity, your language, even your name, because no one here cared who you used to be, only who you could kill. And when the day came that you were selected for your first match, not in the Colosseum but a smaller amphitheater near the Tiber, for local entertainment, and you were handed a dull blade and a wooden shield and pushed out into the sunlit arena, where the crowd's roar hit you like a wave of heat. You nearly vomited from fear, because across from you stood a man twice your size, covered in scars and rage, whose only reason for not killing you outright was to prolong the spectacle. And as you raised your weapon and felt it tremble in your hand, you realized the greatest tragedy of all. You didn't even know what day it was anymore, because time here wasn't measured in minutes or hours, but in breaths. How many you had left, and as your opponent lunged and your instincts kicked in, clumsy and slow, and the crowd booed, and the sun blinded you, and the dust choked you, and your blade struck nothing but air, you understood that no amount of imagination, no movie, no textbook, no tour guide could ever prepare you for this, for Rome, where a single day was a lifetime of terror, and that lifetime was ending, now. And just when you thought that death in the arena would be a mercy compared to another sunrise of pain, your clumsy, terrified swing happened to graze your opponent's thigh. A lucky, foolish, accidental strike that drew a shallow cut and a louder roar from the blood-hungry crowd, which gave the seasoned gladiator pause not because he feared you, but because he now saw potential entertainment, the possibility of drawing out your agony for their amusement. So instead of ending you quickly, he began to toy with you, landing sharp blows with the flat of his blade, knocking you to your knees, then letting you rise again and again, while laughter echoed through the amphitheater and dust filled your lungs and you bled from your brow where your own shield had cracked your skull during one of your many failed blocks. And as your vision blurred, and your legs trembled like reeds in a storm, you managed, through sheer panic, muscle memory, and some primal will to live, to thrust your sword once more, this time into your opponent's abdomen, where it stuck briefly, before he collapsed in disbelief, gurgling and cursing and staring at you with something like betrayal in his eyes. And the crowd, stunned at first, erupted into cheers, not for your skill or bravery, but for the sheer absurdity that a trembling, nameless slave had felled a man worth 10 times his weight in gold. And before you could even register what had happened, 2 attendants rushed you off the sand and into a dark chamber where your wounds were poorly cleaned with vinegar and your collar was replaced with a tag marking you as survivor, a word that brought neither comfort nor pride, because it meant only that your next fight would be harder, your opponents stronger, the expectations crueler. And in the following days, or was it weeks, you were fed better food, trained more harshly, and watched more closely, for now the Lanista saw in you a rare opportunity, the miracle man, the foreigner who killed by accident, the underdog Rome loved to devour. And as you adjusted to this new role, this reluctant celebrity in a world that thrived on death and spectacle, your nights were haunted not just by the faces of those you'd seen die, but by the creeping thought that maybe, just maybe, you were adapting, becoming something else, so meon else. And when you caught yourself smiling at a sarcastic joke made by a fellow fighter, a one-eyed Thracian who'd killed more men than he could count, you felt a bolt of fear not because he scared you, but because the camaraderie did, the belonging did, the understanding that maybe the longer you survived, the more of your past would slip away, until there was nothing left but Rome and blood and iron. And when the time came for you to enter the arena again, this time as a featured match, not a filler, you found yourself breathing calmly, gripping the hilt of your gladius with a steadier hand, your tunic tighter, your arms more muscled, your heart colder, and you wondered whether survival was still your goal, or if now you craved something worse: approval, recognition, even glory. And as the gate opened and the sun hit your face again, and the roar of the people washed over you like a tide of madness, you stepped onto the sand not as a visitor from the future or a victim of time, but as a player in their brutal theater, fully knowing that in ancient Rome, even survival meant surrendering everything that once made you human. And though you survived, if that's even the right word for what happened in that pit of cheering savagery and blinding sunlight, and though your name, or rather the name they gave you, Spurious, meaning falseborn, began to echo in the mouths of the street children, the gossiping matrons, and the scribbled slates of aspiring poets in the taverns near the Subura, the truth is that nothing about this existence could be called living, because when you were summoned by your Dominus One, sweltering evening, told to bathe, shave, and wear a dyed tunic of imperial purple, the kind no slave should ever touch, and then escorted through the winding alleys of Rome to a domus in the Esquiline Hill district with marble columns and impluvium pools reflecting torchlight like pools of fire, you realized your role had shifted, not away from danger, but toward a subtler, quieter hell, for now you were property of a senator. Not to fight, but to entertain, not with swords, but with conversation, charm, humiliation. And though the food was richer, the wine sweeter, the linen softer, the price was no less brutal, because your audience was now Rome's elite, men and women so steeped in their own power that they saw in you not a person, but a novelty, a barbarian made docile, a beast that could speak, and they asked you questions about your homeland, your strange accent, your knowledge of things they claimed were omens, and laughed whether your answers made sense or not, because it wasn't about truth, it was about performance. And you knew that one wrong word, one misstep, could have you whipped, sold, or worse. And so you smiled, you played along, you drank their spiced wine and listened to their cruel jokes. And at night, lying on a cushioned slave mat beside a mosaic of Neptune, you stared at the painted ceiling and wondered what part of you had truly survived. Because your body was healed, yes, but your soul, your mind, had begun to fracture under the weight of constant watchfulness, forced civility, and the impossibility of escape, for even if you ran, where would you go? What would you eat? How would you speak? And so you lingered in this golden cage, learning to read their expressions, mimic their gestures, absorbed their language, Latin, Greek, sarcasm, lies, until one night, as a particularly cruel guest demanded you recite a made-up history of your birth. In the land beyond the Pillars of Hercules, you wove such a fantastic story that the whole table burst into tears of laughter, and your Dominus clapped like a child, and you smiled. Truly smiled, and hated yourself more than ever before, because in that moment you realized they had broken you, not with whips, not with chains, but with praise, and that, in ancient Rome, was the most terrifying truth of all, that survival might mean becoming what they wanted, not what you were, and that some fates, like comfort in captivity, were worse than death in the arena. And as the seasons shifted and Rome's skies turned from the suffocating blue haze of summer to the gray damp of winter, your role as an ornament in a senator's household began to mutate, for you had learned not just to survive the evening gatherings with sly smiles and sharp quips, but to anticipate your master's moods, to adjust your tone to suit his guests. Philosophers one day, generals the next. Perfumed poets with too much wine in their mouths and blood on their hands, and with each clever line you delivered, with each story you embroidered from scraps of your real past and dreams of a future you were beginning to forget, your value increased, and with it, your danger. For now you were being invited not only to dinners but to private consultations, to walk alongside the senator in the forum, to carry scrolls, to observe legal hearings. And though you told yourself this was a step closer to freedom, the truth was more complex, because the more you were trusted, the more you were exposed, and one misheard comment, one misinterpreted look could bring accusations of conspiracy, treachery, or worse. And when another house slave, a quiet Syrian boy who cleaned oil lamps, was found strangled in the atrium, the whisper of poison floated through the household like incense, and you realized no amount of eloquence could protect you from a dagger in the back. So you became sharper still, speaking less, watching more, learning not just Latin but silence, the most Roman of all skills. And then, without warning, the senator summoned you to his study, offered you wine, and asked, casually, as if requesting a massage, whether you would be willing to act as a messenger to a neighboring villa in Ostia, to deliver a sealed scroll to an associate whose name you dared not repeat. And though every instinct screamed trap, you nodded, took the scroll, and departed at dawn with a slave's ration of olives, hard bread, and watered wine, your thoughts twisting with fear and fragile hope, for if you succeeded in this mission, perhaps there would be reward, and if not, well, the Tiber was always hungry, and so you walked, and walked, and walked through the countryside, past vineyards and roadside shrines, sleeping under trees, bartering with farmers for figs in exchange for stories, and after 3 days, you arrived at the villa, a marble-floored estate filled with murmuring slaves and peacocks, where you handed off the scroll, received no reply, and were given another message to return with, which you did, weary but intact. And when the senator read the returned scroll and merely nodded, saying nothing, not praise, not rebuke, just, well done, you felt something stir in you, not pride, not exactly, but a flicker of identity. A sense that maybe, just maybe, you were becoming something in this world, even if that something was neither citizen nor slave, either gladiator nor ghost, but a shadow that could slip between them all. And when you looked in a polished bronze mirror that night, you didn't recognize your own eyes, not because of age or hunger, but because the fear in them was now purposeful, not paralyzing. And that was the most dangerous transformation of all. Not that you had survived Rome, but that you were starting to understand it, maybe even belong. And as your name, or rather, the name they had given you, began to circulate in whispered tones beyond the marble walls of your master's villa and into the ears of men in darker corners of the city, men with ink-stained hands and gold-threaded togas, whose smiles were daggers and whose words could topple a province, you sensed that your usefulness had reached a new level. One no longer tied to amusement or menial tasks but to information, influence, and perhaps espionage for the senator. Once so aloof, now asked you questions about what you heard while refilling cups, What tone the merchant from Carthago used when discussing grain shipments, how the general reacted when wine was spilled near his scrolls, and the questions became more pointed, more dangerous. Whom did the tribune meet in the temple of Janus? Who paid for the Syrian's funeral? Did the Greek tutor speak Latin well, or was it an act? And you, ever observant, ever adaptive, began to answer with careful truths, partial lies, and measured pauses, until you were summoned not to the study, but to a private chamber beneath the house, where oil lamps flickered against frescoes of mythic betrayals, and your master stood with another man whose face you recognized not from dinners, but from temple statues, a praetor, a man of immense legal power, who asked you in a voice like cold marble whether you were loyal to Rome, and though your throat tightened and your heart thundered, you answered yes, because the only true answer in Rome was survival, and loyalty was just another word for utility. And so began your descent into Rome's deepest pit, the world of watchers, informants, backroom bribes, coded letters tucked into loaves of bread, and late-night messages carried through sewer tunnels while your eyes scanned every shadow for betrayal. And though part of you was sickened by the duplicity, by the knowledge that men you'd shared meals with would be exiled, imprisoned, or executed because of something you reported, another part of you, colder, older, more Roman, began to understand that this, too, was a kind of arena, and if you were going to play the game, you had to play to win. And when your master introduced you to his patron, a man so powerful even his slaves bowed from 3 rooms away, and that man took interest in you, asked where you had studied, you lied, of course. Alexandria, always a good lie, and laughed at your self-deprecating wit. You knew you were being groomed for something larger, something riskier, and you wondered, in the dead of night when even the Lara's statues seemed to hold their breath, whether you were climbing a ladder or digging a grave, and when one of your messages led to the arrest of a tax official, and the senator rewarded you with a small pouch of silver and a rare word of praise, sapiens, wise, you felt no joy, only a growing void where your past used to be, because you could no longer remember your own language fluently, your own time clearly, only the structure of Rome, the rules, the whispers, the silence. And when you caught your reflection again, this time in a polished helmet as you passed a cohort on the street, you saw not the foreigner, not the victim, but something else entirely, a Roman in all but name, a ghost in sandals, and you feared, truly feared, that even if you somehow escaped, if you returned to your century with its glass and light and speed, you would never unlearn the silence, the suspicion, the shadow within, and maybe, worst of all, you wouldn't want to. And as your presence became expected, your voice trusted, your face familiar in the shadowy corners of the Curia and the marble courtyards of Rome's political class, you began to realize that the chains that once clinked around your ankles had been replaced by softer ones: obligation, leverage, influence. And though you no longer carried messages by foot or waited behind columns listening for secrets, now you sat beside men who shaped provinces with ink and quiet threats, who toasted your wit in public and whispered your value in private, and though they never called you citizen, they no longer called you slave, which in Rome was as close to liberty as most would ever reach. And yet even amid this illusion of ascent, with your new tunic of fine linen, your bronze pen, your seat at the side of men who governed by decree, you began to see the cracks. In their faces, in the state, in yourself. For each document you copied was not just law but corruption. Each scroll sealed was a silent betrayal. And when a name you once laughed with at a banquet reappeared on an execution list you were told to duplicate in triplicate, your hand trembled for only a moment before the muscle memory took over. And you wrote as you had been trained to write, beautifully, indifferently, Romanly. And in that moment you understood the Empire's true power was not its legions or laws, but its ability to turn pain into process, fear into protocol. And as you stood on the Palatine one cool evening, watching the lights of the city flicker like dying stars across the Tiber, your master, no, your patron now, placed a hand on your shoulder and spoke in a tone that chilled your bones, not because of what he said, but how. You have done well, Amicus. It is time you begin thinking not only as a servant of Rome, but as Rome itself. And though your lips answered with humble gratitude, your heart clenched because you knew, deep inside, that there would be no return from this path, no waking up. In your soft bed centuries ahead, no restoration of self untouched by empire. And when a younger scribe approached you that same week, asking nervously for guidance, and you saw in his eyes the same fear, the same curiosity, the same fragile hope you once carried, you told him, gently, honestly, to forget who he was, to listen, to learn, to disappear into usefulness. And as he nodded, as he thanked you, as he walked away into a destiny not yet carved, you realized with a cold finality that you had become what Rome demanded, not a man who survived the city, but one who upheld it, fed it, even as it devoured everything he used to be. And as the whispers grew louder, not about you directly, but about shifting alliances, border unrest, the aging emperor's failing health and the ambitions of younger men with sharper knives and smoother tongues, you found yourself drawn deeper into the coils of Rome's final game, where names were no longer names but signals, where loyalty had half-life and silence was not safety but currency. And when your patron summoned you to a villa beyond the city under the guise of a literary retreat, only to find there 3 senators, a military tribune, and a Jewish astrologer with ink-stained fingers and tired eyes, you realized that this was not a council of scholars, but conspirators, and that your presence was not incidental, for they no longer saw you as a tool, but as a vessel, empty of past, useful in the present, expendable in the future. And the scroll they handed you, sealed with a stamp you were not meant to recognize, bore instructions that no honest man would carry. And yet, you took it, nodded, bowed, walked out under the veil of night with the taste of wax and ash on your tongue, and for the first time in all your Roman days you truly hesitated, not because of fear. Fear had long become background noise, but because of clarity. Because you saw the thread that linked every moment, every choice, the first step in the forum, the cell, the collar, the arena, the ink, the shadow, and now this, a message that could shift the weight of power from one man to another, from one tyranny to a new and uncertain version. And as you reached the edge of the city where the aqueducts loomed like silent judges over the hills, you stopped, hands trembling not from cold but consequence, and wondered what would happen if you simply disappeared, burned the scroll, walked east, found a port, became a ghost in the provinces. But then you remembered the boy you once advised, now a watcher in your old post, the woman who whispered warnings in the marketplace, the soldier whose name you had once cleared with a forged note, and you understood with aching certainty that even if you fled, Rome would never let go, because once you learned to survive here, you never truly left, only shifted roles, and so you turned, not back to your master, not directly to the conspirators, but to a third way, a reckless way, a mad idea formed from fragments of modern instinct and Roman cunning, to leak the scroll's contents not to the target nor the sender, but to the one man who still believed in law, the aged censor who had retired to a coastal villa in shame after losing a vote to those now plotting in whispers, and it was he who met your words with silence. Then quiet horror, then action, and within 2 days Rome shifted again. Not by battle, not by fire, but by exposure, and though heads rolled and yours was nearly among them, the old man shielded you, declared you instrumentum Dei, a tool of the gods, and offered you not reward, but a choice, return to the shadows and serve the Republic's last flicker, or disappear from history completely, and you, weary, hollow, Roman, answered only, I was never here. And so, as the waves murmured against the rocks below the censor's villa, you sat beneath a cypress tree, hands folded, listening not to the sea, but to the echo of your own breath, slow, measured, purposeful, for the first time in years not dictated by urgency or surveillance, but by the strange quiet that comes after a storm where your name was almost erased, or immortalized in the margins. The old man had returned inside, left you there with a jug of watered wine, a fresh tunic, and a final instruction, wait until nightfall, then decide. You did not decide. Not at once. Because there was nothing left in you that trusted the weight of choices. You had been used too many times, survived too many corridors of power and blood to believe that any path was clear. The Republic's last flicker, he had said that, hadn't he? A poetic phrase, almost cruel. For what was a flicker in a city so used to flames? The Republic had been dying since before you were born, its carcass dragged from consul to emperor, from senate to spectacle, until all that remained was ritual and rot. And yet, you could not deny that something had changed. Not in Rome, not truly, but in you. Because now you knew silence could be broken. Not loudly, not heroically, but precisely. Like a scalpel sliding beneath the skin of empire. The leak had worked. Not all had been exposed. Too many shadows remained untouched. But the plot had fractured. Men had fallen. And you had survived again. Not through luck, not through strength, but by understanding the game better than its players. Night fell slowly, with the kind of softness that only coastal winds could bring. You rose, finally, and walked the perimeter of the villa, not pacing, but measuring. Every step a reflection of the life you might still lead. You could leave now. The censor had promised you that. There were ships in the harbor. A forged name already prepared. Gold, modest but sufficient, hidden in an amphora marked for oil. You could vanish into the east, become a scholar in Antioch, or a translator in Alexandria. You could let your past calcify in the dust of distant streets. But no. You returned inside. The censor was by the hearth, sharpening a reed pen, his face unreadable in the firelight. He didn't look up when you entered, only gestured to the second stool and the parchment before him. Without speaking, you sat. You reached for the pen. You began to write. It was not a confession, nor a testimony. It was a ledger. Names, codes, dates, partial truths with just enough venom to wound. You were giving him your eyes, your memory, your caution. You were giving him the web of Roman survival as only a survivor could render it. Because what he lacked was not ideals, but intelligence. And what you lacked, though you hated to admit it, was purpose. For hours you worked in silence. Occasionally he nodded. Once he poured wine. Neither of you toasted. There was no joy here, only duty. By dawn, the ledger was half done. Your hands ached. Your back throbbed. But your mind, for the first time in months, felt clear. The censor spoke then, voice like dry parchment. We will make them see. Slowly. Carefully. Not with blades. Not yet. You did not answer. Because your answer was already written on the page, in the neat Roman hand of a man who once forged documents to save a stranger's life, who once memorized the cadence of lies, who once stood beneath aqueducts and wondered if escape was ever real. You had chosen the shadows. But this time, they would not devour you. They would serve. And when, months later, the edicts began to shift, subtle reforms here, sudden arrests there, a senator's disgrace whispered through the forum. No one spoke your name. No one remembered your face. You became, at last, what Rome had always made of its truest agents, not heroes, not traitors, but instruments. And in time you came to prefer it. You stopped dreaming of the provinces. You stopped fearing knives. You learned again to walk the streets of Rome without being noticed, and in every whisper, every sideways glance, you heard not danger, but opportunity. For the first time, you were not surviving Rome. You were shaping it. Quietly, relentlessly. And when the censor died, old, tired, content, his final note was left in your hand, unsigned, unwitnessed, bearing only 4 words. Keep the fire small. And you did. And so you kept the fire small, feeding it not with wood but with fragments, a name here, a favor there, a whisper seeded into the ear of a magistrate who owed more than he admitted, a grain shipment rerouted from a senator's estate to a hungry district, a scribe promoted for silence, a spy punished for honesty, and in this dance of quiet influence, you found a rhythm not unlike prayer, but older, more Roman, where each action echoed in the forum like a footstep in marble halls, and though your name never surfaced, your work did, spoken in euphemisms by those who understood that power no longer announced itself in proclamations but moved in eddies and soft folds, in erased lines and corrected ledgers, and you, no longer merely a survivor, became a curator of decay, slowing it, guiding it, containing it like a cracked dam holding back centuries of flood. Until you stopped seeing yourself as a man and more as a function, a necessity, not because you believed in Rome, but because Rome, in all its madness, still believed in you, not by voice but by vacancy, the way fire believes in the shape of its lantern, And when the new consul was elected, a cautious moderate with thin wrists and sharp eyes, you were summoned not by name but by an object. A wax seal once used by the old censor, broken in half and handed to you in a public bath by a boy no older than you had once been. And with that token you knew. The line had not broken, only thinned, and though the faces had changed, the need had not. And once more you walked into a house you did not know, sat at a table made of olive wood, listened to men speak not of ideals but of balance, of stall and collapse just long enough to matter, and once again you said nothing, only nodded, accepted the satchel of reports, the ink, the key to a room hidden behind a defunct bakery near the Janiculum Hill, and as you left, you wondered, not for the first time, if this was what eternity meant, not glory or peace, but repetition, an empire of echoes, and men like you fated not to live but to persist, to bear Rome's weight in silence until someone else forgot, and ruin returned. But until then, you would hold the line, not as a hero, not as a martyr, but as what you had always been becoming, an absence made useful, a shadow given structure, Rome's most loyal fiction. And with each passing season, the fiction deepened, not just in the minds of those who handed you keys and codes, but in yourself, until the memory of your own name felt like a rumor told in bad weather, until your reflection in the brass of an unpolished basin startled you with its hollowness, the same way an abandoned temple startles not with ghosts but with absence. For you had become an echo, yes, but not one that faded. Rather one that repeated, shaped by architecture and need and Rome. Ever hungry for continuity beneath its chaos, found in you a rhythm it could neither explain nor dislodge, a trusted cipher in a city built on forgetting. And so your days became parchment and silence, thresholds and murmurs, learning to read intent in gestures, betrayal in coughs, loyalty in what was not said, and always the fire, that small fire, quietly tended, never allowed to roar, never permitted to die. Because should it die, the shadows would turn wild, and wild shadows consume cities from within faster than armies ever could, and it was in this fragile tension that you found your role not merely functional, but strangely sacred, not wholly in the gods and altars sense, but in the Roman way, the old, cynical reverence for what endures. And endure you did, through another failed grain season, through a fiscal scandal buried beneath invented pirates, through a vestal's mysterious exile, through a plot within the scribe that never reached the capital because a letter was lost by a man you once bought wine for 10 years ago, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, you realized you were no longer cleaning up Rome's messes, you were preempting them, reconfiguring them, anticipating fault lines before they cracked open, not as prophecy, but as logic, a cold, precise reading of a city that breathes corruption like air. And one night, in that quiet room behind the bakery, surrounded by maps, lists, and the scent of old ink, you paused mid-sentence and asked aloud, to know. 1. Is this what ruling feels like? Not because you ruled, not directly, but because those who did now orbited the systems you curated, the cautions you issued in unsigned memos, the quiet reassurances passed between factions that had no reason to trust each other except for the persistence of a name they never spoke, only implied. And still, you stayed in the shadows, not out of fear now, but out of understanding, because visibility was volatility. And Rome had taught you, over and over, that the brightest torches always became targets, and you were no torch. You were a wall, a hinge, a silence that chose when to break. And so when the plague reached the port, and the Senate faltered, and panic swept the lower districts like wildfire through dry brush, it was your network, your hidden map of favors and forgotten doors that held the city together long enough for the physicians and the soldiers to act. And afterward, when the consul made his speech, when he praised the unseen architects of order, there were a few who glanced toward the Juniculum Hill, toward that bakery that never sold bread, and though no names were spoken, you felt the pressure of it in your bones, that weight of being indispensable and unacknowledged, of holding a city together with ink and fear and the unrelenting discipline of someone who had nothing left to lose but Rome itself. And that night, you did not sleep, not from unrest, but from a strange, quiet awe. Because somehow, against all design, you had become not merely part of the machine, but its memory, its instinct, and for the first time, perhaps ever, you smiled thinly, like a man watching a fragile flame in the dark and knowing it will not go out, not tonight. And not tonight became not this week, not this month, not this year, until time itself unraveled into a quiet, perpetual rhythm, not of events, but of prevention, of nudges so subtle they barely left a ripple, and so your life passed in the margins of other lives, the tribune who never received that letter urging revolt, the praetor who met the right philosopher just before his bitterness ripened into treason, the scribe who was quietly paid to copy scrolls no one would ever read, but whose loyalty proved essential when the grain records needed revision, and you, always between, always behind, became a kind of myth among those who worked in the cracks, the ones who moved ink instead of steel, the ones who understood that in Rome, words could kill slower but more surely than blades. And still, no one spoke. Your name, not fully, only the initials of a forged title, a pattern scratched into wood beneath a tavern bench, a gesture passed between messengers like a priest's blessing, and with each cycle, you felt your body slow, your bones grow brittle, but your mind remained sharpened by necessity. Because even as regimes softened or hardened, even as one emperor choked on a fig and another wept at games, the shape of Rome stayed the same, vast, cracking, beautiful, cruel, and in need of one who would never again ask for thanks. And in the twilight of your usefulness, when your joints refused stairs and your sight blurred by candlelight, a new generation came, not children, not heirs, but echoes, reflections, younger yous molded by the system you'd helped curate, each carrying parts of your knowledge but none of your burden, and you trained them not with pride, but precision. Because sentiment was dangerous, and you had long since burned out your capacity for it, like a wick, trimmed to its last glow. And eventually, one night, you walked out of the bakery for the last time, no scroll in hand, no mission awaiting, only the feel of warm wind and the weightlessness of a role completed, and you wandered the city not like a guardian or a ghost, but as a man, simply a man, past the places you once feared, once worked in, once changed, the forum, the old holding cells, the ink-stained steps of the old censor's villa now sealed and ivy-covered, and you felt something unfamiliar, not regret, not nostalgia, but a kind of gentle vanishing, as though the city itself was allowing you to dissolve from its memory, not with force, but with kindness. And by the time you reached the eastern gate, where once you had considered fleeing, long ago under the judgment of aqueducts and silence, there was no decision left to make, only release. And as the road opened before you, dusty, empty, leading not away from Rome, but into a different kind of obscurity, you whispered, not a farewell, but a reminder, spoken only to the night, keep the fire small. And then you walked on, not toward a future, not into exile, but into the long, soft anonymity that only true servants of empires ever earn. And in time, even that faded, until you became what Rome always required at its most fragile edges. Not a hero, not a villain, not even a man, but the shape of stability, the shadow of continuity, the last quiet breath before history moves on. And as you walked beyond the reach of marble and law, past the last milestones inscribed with the names of forgotten consuls, into hills where olive trees bent without witness and the road grew narrow with disuse, you felt the city behind you not vanish but change. Not a place now, but a pressure, an echo in the ribcage, a weight that would never leave entirely. For Rome did not release its servants, not really, it only reclassified them. From tool to memory, from presence to absence, and so. You wandered, not aimlessly, but without destination, through hamlets where the language still bore Latin's bones but had taken on other rhythms, through marketplaces that smelled of salt and boiled beans and no longer bowed to Rome's calendar. And in each place you were neither foreign nor known, just a man who listened too carefully and spoke too precisely. And the people, fishermen, herders, children with homemade dice, respected your silence in the way animals respect a predator that chooses not to strike. And in the evenings you would sit alone, with cheap wine and a borrowed stool, and let your mind return to the cracks and channels of the old world, wondering not if it had endured, but in what shape, through what compromises. And then one day, in a mountain village where rain fell sideways and goats wandered the temple steps of a ruined outpost, you were approached by a girl, no older than 12, holding a scroll with cracked wax and hands inked with effort, and though she said nothing, her eyes carried that same cautious burden you had once worn like armor, and you understood, without asking, that the line had continued, not because you stayed, but because you left. Because you taught others to remain, because the idea had outlived the body. And so you took the scroll and read it slowly beneath a half-broken lintel, and found, to your surprise, not a request for action, not a map or cipher or instruction, but a letter addressed to you, written by a hand you recognized, one of the last you trained, now a man grown and entrusted with the city's unspoken veins, and in his words was no urgency, only acknowledgement. A record of small victories and near ruins, of reforms passed by trickery and tribunals avoided by silence, and at the end, only this: the fire is still small, but it is warm. I thought you should know. And you sat with that letter as the rain came down, not smiling, not weeping, only still, as if the body finally understood what the mind had refused to admit for years, that you had won, not loudly, not completely, but meaningfully, that you had outlived your utility in the one way that mattered by ensuring it was no longer necessary. And the next morning you gave the scroll back to the girl, nodding once, and walked on. Not far now, just enough to stay out of reach. And wherever you stopped next, they would know you only as the quiet one who fixed roof tiles without asking, who mended books and knew the stars, who drank little and watched the horizon like it owed him something. And they would never know that once, long ago, in a city that devoured its makers, you had chosen not to become legend, but to become the silence that made legends possible. And in that silence, Rome endured. And so it was that your name vanished not with violence or forgetting, but through preservation by omission, a rare and deliberate act, more Roman than any triumph, for those who carried the weight after you understood that certain names, once spoken too often, lose their shape, their power, become tools in the mouths of lesser men. And so your memory was folded into practices, into habits, into a certain way of noticing the world. The double check of a seal, the pause before a decision, the silence before a name is written down. And as generations passed, this pattern remained, like a well-worn groove in a marble step, inexplicable unless you knew the history, and invisible if you didn't. And far from the Palatine, in your quiet hill country, seasons passed with the grace of an old song, slow and uninsistent, and the man you became was simple, but not small, a man who taught village boys to read by candlelight, who mended fishing nets with knots he learned in another life, who never asked questions but somehow always knew when someone needed a favor and never called it such. And though you said little, when you did speak, people listened, not because your words were loud, but because they were few, and each held the weight of a city no one around you had ever seen, except perhaps in coins or in rumors from traveling priests. And sometimes, when the wind was strong and the olives bent low, you would walk out to the ridge at dusk and look west toward the vague shimmer where Rome might still be, and you'd feel it, faint but steady, like a second heartbeat, and you knew then that the city had not collapsed, not truly, it had merely shifted, become a quieter thing, still vicious, still grand, but capable of subtlety now, of retreat, of strategy that did not require blood. And though your joints ached and your eyes blurred, you remained Rome's last servant in exile, not because you were exiled by force, but because you knew the most useful service was distance, was not interfering, was being a name never spoken but always accounted for. And when at last you felt the time coming, when even the sun felt heavy and the air thick with finality, you gathered your tools, swept your home, burned the few letters you had kept, and walked once more to the ridge, alone. And there, with only sky and stone and the wind for witness, you sat and closed your eyes, not with sadness, not with fear, but with an understanding that even this moment was part of a design, that your fading was not disappearance, but integration, and in the cities, distant but still breathing, someone you had once taught without knowing it would glance at a report and hesitate, just long enough to prevent a mistake. Someone else would choose a lesser evil because it felt correct, not because it was ordered. And none of them would know your name, not really, but they would feel it, like a pressure behind the eyes, a weight in the spine, a whisper before sleep. Be precise, be patient, be small, and endure. And in that way, you became what every empire dreams of and fears, a man who vanished so completely, he was everywhere. And the years that followed, after the body had returned to earth somewhere between two shepherds' paths no map would ever mark, brought no memorial, no statue, no cult of remembrance, only continuity, quiet and precise, as if the absence of your name had been part of a greater plan all along. In the archives beneath what was once the tabularium, a marginal note in an old, unnumbered volume warned of an unnamed courier who once rewrote the fate of consuls. In a hidden chamber beneath a senator's house, young scribes were taught to hold their breath when reading sealed orders, not for reverence, but to hear what wasn't written. And in a dusty storage room behind a basilica, someone still kept a faded cloak, unstained, meticulously folded. No record of who it belonged to, no reason to preserve it, and yet it remained. And this, more than gold or carving, was memory, the Roman kind, the kind that lives in systems. Reflexes, shadows, the kind that understands that power is not in thunder, but in restraint, in not acting until it matters, in knowing when to speak and what not to say. And so your legacy moved without name or center, like wind through ruins, invisible but shaping everything. And in times of crisis, when plots cracked like ice beneath sandal and scroll, when tribunals lost their heads to crowd whims and generals returned too early from victories they were not meant to win, someone always remembered. Not you, but the pattern you left behind, the method. The triple check, the silence, the choice not to strike. And Rome, eternal in arrogance, only survived because of those echoes. Because beneath the shouting marble and drunken oratory, something still held, something quiet, a backbone in the mist. And once, many winters later, in a remote villa where citrus trees grew crooked from long-forgotten soil, a child found a small wooden token hidden inside the leg of a collapsed writing desk. Carved not with symbols but a single line of text in poor Old Latin, non fui sed eram. I was not, yet I was. And though no one understood its purpose, though it ended up tossed into a drawer with dull knives and broken seals, it stayed, untouched, waiting, as if the world might one day need your kind again. Not kings, not killers, not oracles, but quiet men with long memories, steady hands, and no hunger for credit, only clarity. And so the story ends not with a death, not with glory, but with what Rome always truly feared and secretly needed, a silence that outlasted ambition. And long after your hands had stilled, after the last olive tree bent over your forgotten ridge and the sun carved deeper cracks into the stones of outposts no one patrolled anymore, the city, or what remained of it, rolled forward, reshaped and renamed, empires born from its bones, languages bloomed from its throat, laws passed down not through reverence, but inertia, and somewhere beneath marble ruins overgrown with time and nettle, the echo of your decisions still clicked like clockwork. Faint, deliberate, intact, and though the world changed costumes and capitals, the shape of power remained familiar. Men gathered in corners, scrolls sealed in wax, silence used like a knife, and across centuries, someone always remembered to pause before delivering the final word. Someone always questioned the cleanness of a victory that came too easily. Someone always walked the longer path when a quicker one reeked of show. And though they never spoke your name, never knew it, they moved like you once moved, weighed words as you once did, and somewhere inside them, even buried beneath new creeds and banners, the old reflex lived on: wait, listen, confirm. And in this way, Rome lived not in temples or triumphs, but in the restraint of one man walking away when he could have taken more, in the idea that the truest power is not grasped, but withheld, used like a key, not a sword, and perhaps, in a monastery centuries later, a monk copying a law code felt a chill he couldn't name, paused, and corrected a clause that might have allowed a tyrant's assent. And perhaps that monk dreamed that night of a man in worn sandals watching from a distance, saying nothing, and perhaps, in a marble hall in the new capital of some future realm, an advisor hesitated before signing off on an order, and though he could not explain why, he adjusted a single phrase, and perhaps, somewhere, the old fire still burned, not large, never large, but steady, tucked inside those who knew how to read between silences, how to measure the space between what is said and what is meant. And in that fire you still lived, not as myth, not as memory, but as design, the architecture of caution, the map beneath the map. And in the end, when all the empires broke like waves against time and dust, only that remained, a certain way of seeing the world, precise, patient, invisible, the long shadow of a man who never asked to be remembered, and so could never be forgotten. And the centuries folded like pages too long handled, parchment browned and brittle, empires swollen then bled dry, and still, always still, in the seams of new cities built atop old ash, there remained that shape, that faint, unmistakable outline of restraint disguised as accident, of quiet hands shaping loud histories, and in the academies of distant lands where they taught law not as justice but as chess, there lingered, unnamed, the doctrine you once embodied, that survival was not instinct, but art, that the hand unseen was the only hand that mattered, and in certain letters between certain ministers of uncertain kingdoms, phrases echoed you without knowing it, not yet, not openly, not through him. And sometimes, just sometimes, when a throne teetered or a republic flirted with collapse, someone far from center, someone whose name would never enter a speech or be carved on a stone, would act, not boldly, not grandly, but correctly, and the balance would return. Quiet as breath, invisible as nightfall, and those closest would wonder how it happened, who had made the final call, and they would never know that it was not one person, but a pattern reborn. And in this way, your story became not legacy but climate, a kind of moral weather, a cold front that settled over the conscience of careful men, whispering that power spent loudly is power spent foolishly, and that the true hand never shakes. It writes, then disappears, and in a city no longer called Rome, beneath a basilica built from stolen marble, a scholar once found a half-rotted scroll tucked into the binding of a forgotten codex, and on it, faded but legible, were the words, "Trust no savior, praise no purity, protect the quiet. They will outlast us all," unsigned, unclaimed, undated, and the scholar, feeling the weight of it without understanding why, transcribed it, footnoted it, debated it, and then, wisely, filed it away in a drawer marked origin uncertain, and outside. Life went on, nations rose and stumbled, voices shouted into parliaments and vanished, statues were built and torn down, and still, beneath it all, the old current moved, invisible, patient, unglorified, and at the edge of some village, centuries removed from any senate, A man with no documents and no clear past repaired a broken cart with the ease of someone who had once held empires in place. And when the villagers offered him bread and a name, he took only the bread and smiled like someone who understood exactly how fragile the world truly was, and how little needed to be done to keep it from breaking. And in the quiet years that followed, the kind of years no historian bothers to name, the current that bore your pattern did not fade, but settled deeper into basements, margins, second drafts, unread footnotes, and hesitant glances exchanged behind closed doors, until even those who carried it no longer knew from where it came, only that it was the right thing to do, the precise weight of silence, the calibrated pause before assent. And in this strange afterlife, you were not alone, for others like you had walked away too, men and women who once stood too near the fire and stepped back without falling into bitterness or fame, who knew that some systems only endure if no one takes credit for saving them. And so, across ages, in hidden libraries and border stations, in dusty courtrooms and under lanterns at sea, there lived this constellation of caution, of half-remembered rituals passed not through doctrine but practice, not through law but tone, and though your name had never been spoken aloud in generations, it was there in the way a seal was broken over steam instead of cold, in how a question was phrased to deflect attention from the true subject, in how a single nod could mean, "I understand, we will not speak of this again." And centuries later, in a city rising over layers of forgotten brick, when a fire threatened to consume more than buildings, an idea, a structure, a fragile alignment of truth and tolerance, the ones who acted did so not because they believed they could win, but because they knew someone had to act in the exact right way, at the exact right moment, and disappear again. And when it was done, when the storm passed without spectacle, without martyrdom, they gathered for a quiet meal under the cover of a charity meeting, no toasts, no names exchanged. Only one woman, older than she looked, raising her glass slightly and saying, "To the man who was never here." And the others nodded, some not knowing who she meant, some knowing too well, and none asking further, because by then, it wasn't about you, or even about Rome. It was about continuity without command, about justice that arrived without spectacle, about the long, nearly invisible line that held civilizations upright not through glory, but through decisions no one saw made. And in the end, when the last archive closed, and the last stone tablet crumbled, and all the names had been rewritten or forgotten, it was this that remained, the discipline of restraint, the craft of vanishing, the proof that in a world addicted to spectacle, salvation still came, quietly, from those who refused to be seen. And so the centuries spun on, empires rising like tides only to recede into the sands. But the unseen current you set in motion endured, a network of silent guardians, shadows who never claimed credit, who moved like ghosts through halls of power, mending fractures before they split the whole. And though their faces changed with time, their purpose remained, to preserve the fragile balance between order and chaos, not through force, but through subtlety, to wield power by knowing when not to wield it. And as the world grew more complex, more sprawling, more deafening, their presence became more necessary. For in the clamor of crowds and clash of swords, the quiet hand was the only thing that kept the machine running, the only thing that stopped it from tearing itself apart. And somewhere, far from any capital, a journal lay forgotten in the dust of a scholar's desk, its pages inscribed with a single, cryptic line. He who fades first casts the longest shadow, and those who stumbled upon it would feel, without understanding, a deep resonance, a truth too subtle for loud voices, a whisper carried across millennia, from a man who chose not to be legend, but to be the silence beneath legend, the thread beneath tapestry, the weight beneath crown. And thus, the story you never told became the story that never ended. And in the stillness that followed countless turns of history's wheel, when the roar of battlefields had softened to distant echoes and the ink on treaties was yellowed beyond legibility, the spirit of your choice, to vanish rather than dominate, to shape rather than command, settled into the very marrow of governance itself, whispered through the corridors of power as an unspoken rule, that true strength lies not in being seen, but in knowing when to remain unseen, that survival is less about conquest and more about preservation. And as cities rose anew from the ruins of old, as languages morphed and kingdoms fractured, there always remained those who understood this lesson. Without being taught, those who moved with deliberate care, who balanced ambition with discretion, and when the time came, acted with precision born of centuries of silent practice. And though your name was lost to time, the imprint of your decision endured, like a quiet pulse beneath the frantic heartbeat of empires, a steady hand guiding without grip, a shadow that neither clung nor fled but simply was. And perhaps, in a distant future when all histories have been rewritten or erased, a solitary figure will pause, sensing the weight of absence and presence intertwined, feeling the echo of a man who was never meant to be remembered, but whose choice shaped the fate of worlds. And in that moment, the silence will speak louder than any story ever told. And when the last scrolls crumbled to dust and the once great forums lay silent beneath layers of earth and memory, your legacy lived on not in monuments or songs, but in the unyielding rhythm of caution that pulsed through the veins of every city, every court, every whisper of power, in the measured breath before a ruler's decree, in the guarded glance exchanged between allies and rivals, in the invisible web of loyalties that held civilizations together without fanfare or flourish. And though no chronicler ever dared to trace this pattern back to its source, it was as real as the stone beneath feet, as constant as the turning of stars, a testament to a truth Rome itself once understood but could never admit, that the greatest strength is often found in the quiet refusal to be seen. And so, beyond time and tale, beyond triumph and tragedy, you remain, not a name on a monument, but a pulse beneath history's endless flow, a quiet presence shaping the world without ever stepping into the light. And as the world moved on, civilizations rising and falling like waves on an endless shore, the essence of your choice wove itself into the fabric of countless societies. A whispered philosophy carried by those who understood that power's true currency is not force, but discretion. That influence is best wielded from the shadows, where intentions are hidden but outcomes undeniable. And in the quiet chambers where kings and councils debated fate, there was always someone who acted without claim, who spoke without voice, who moved without presence. And though no history book ever named them, nor any statue captured their likeness, their impact was undeniable, the silent hand that steadied empires and prevented ruin. And perhaps, in the distant future, when all records have been lost and the names of heroes forgotten, the world will still bear the imprint of a man who chose not to be a legend, but to be the silence that sustains legends, the invisible architect of resilience, the eternal shadow beneath the glory. And in that timeless silence, your story, though never told, will endure forever. And so the cycle continued, the silent legacy threading through time like a hidden river beneath the surface of noisy history, shaping destinies with a subtle touch, a glance, a folded note, a withheld word, each small act rippling outward to bend the course of events imperceptibly but irrevocably, until what once was a single choice became a tradition. A discipline practiced by those who understood that the loudest victories are often the first to crumble, while those won in shadows endure. Beyond sight, beyond memory, and across continents and centuries, in halls of power and quiet cottages alike, the spirit of that unseen stewardship lived on, unseen but essential, guiding the delicate balance between chaos and order, between ambition and survival. And though the world would forget your name, the essence of your wisdom remained. Breathed in every cautious pause, every silent sacrifice, every unclaimed triumph, a testament not to the glory of being known, but to the profound power of simply being necessary. And as dawn crept over new empires, their banners fluttering in unfamiliar winds, the invisible thread you wove stretched ever further, linking disparate lands and forgotten peoples through a shared instinct for subtlety and restraint. Generations learned, sometimes consciously, often instinctively, that true influence is a shadow cast not to dazzle, but to steady, a force applied not to conquer, but to preserve. And when tides of upheaval threatened to drown reason, it was always this quiet counsel, passed down like a secret language, that guided decisions toward survival rather than ruin. And though no song was sung of those who moved unseen, their legacy was etched deep into the bedrock of civilization itself, a quiet pulse beneath the clamor of history, an eternal reminder that the greatest power is held not in the throne or sword, but in the steady hand that chooses when and how to act. The whisper that bends fate without ever shouting, and through all time's relentless turning. This unseen wisdom endures, a silent promise that even when empires fall, the art of survival remains, because those who learn to vanish are never truly lost. And in the moments between upheaval and calm, when the world seemed to hold its breath, there were those who sensed the faint presence of a legacy they could not name, a pattern of choices made long ago, echoing still in the quiet folds of power, where ambition met restraint and silence became the language of survival. These unseen architects moved through corridors of influence like ghosts, their actions subtle but decisive, preserving the fragile threads that bound society together without desire for praise or recognition. And as empires rose and fell, their work persisted, weaving a tapestry of continuity stitched not with glory but with patience and discretion. And perhaps, centuries hence, when the last chronicles are lost and history becomes myth, those who still practice this art will feel themselves heirs to an invisible lineage, inheritors of a wisdom born from a man who chose to be forgotten so that civilization might endure. A man who understood that sometimes the greatest act of power is the courage to step away, to let silence do the work words cannot, and in that choice, found immortality not in name, but in influence that shadows time itself. And so the unseen lineage continued, its influence threading through the centuries like a quiet river beneath the noise of history, guiding the hands of those who understood that true strength is often found in restraint, that the greatest victories are those never claimed, and that power wielded too loudly invites ruin, in secret councils, in whispered conversations, in coded letters passed under candlelight. This legacy breathed life into fragile alliances and prevented the collapse of nations, carried forward by those who knew that survival required not only force, but discretion. And though the world would forget the name of the man who first chose silence over fame, his spirit lived on in the unspoken rules that govern every seat of power, in the careful steps taken by cautious souls who understood that sometimes the most profound influence comes from what is left unsaid, and in that silent sway, empires endured. Histories were shaped, and the quiet art of survival became the true foundation of civilization, invisible yet indispensable, eternal as the stars that watched over it all. And as the wheel of time turned onward, carrying with it the rise and fall of countless kingdoms, the essence of your choice, to act from the shadows, to preserve rather than conquer, to influence without being seen, seep deeper into the consciousness of rulers and advisors alike, becoming an unspoken code whispered in the halls of power, a sacred trust passed from one generation to the next. The men and women who embraced this discipline understood that history is not shaped by the loudest voices, but by the patient hands that steady the course beneath the storm. And though no statue or song ever bore your name, your legacy was etched into the very fabric of governance, a quiet force that held fragile states together, a subtle current beneath the tide of ambition, and in that enduring silence, the world found a measure of balance, a hope that no matter how loud the chaos outside grew, within the hidden chambers of decision, reason, patience, and discretion would prevail, guided forever by the ghost of a man who was never meant to be remembered, yet whose influence would never fade. And across the sprawling ages that followed, when empires fractured into countless fragments and new nations carved their places beneath foreign skies, the doctrine of silence and subtlety endured, not as written law or proclaimed creed, but as an instinct, a quiet wisdom shared among those who understood that true power is measured not in dominion, but in preservation, and that the hands that shape history best are those unseen. The hands that guide without grasping, that steady without suffocating, and somewhere deep within the labyrinth of forgotten archives and shattered temples, the echoes of your choices whispered on, informing the delicate balance between ambition and prudence, between impulse and calculation, weaving through centuries like an invisible thread that held together the fragile fabric of human order, reminding those who dared to listen that sometimes the greatest act of courage is to vanish into silence, becoming not a hero, but the very foundation upon which heroes rise and fall. And so, your story, though never spoken aloud, remained alive, a testament to the enduring power of restraint and the quiet art of survival. And as the modern world dawned, its machines humming and lights piercing the night, the essence of your silent legacy adapted, morphing into new forms beneath the veneer of progress. Encoded messages passed through encrypted lines, in the measured speech of diplomats navigating fragile treaties, in the unspoken understandings that preserve peace amidst chaos. Those who wielded this legacy understood that influence no longer required the sword or the scroll, but the careful orchestration of information and discretion. And though the names of old had faded into myth, the principles endured, guiding the unseen architects of the contemporary age. Shadowy figures shaping events from behind the screens and behind closed doors, upholding the balance between order and disorder with the same quiet resolve you once embodied, proving that across millennia, in every age and every language, the art of survival remains the art of silence, and the greatest power lies not in being known, but in knowing when to vanish.